Welcome to the 58th video in the series, Foundations of Communist Organizing. Today we'll be going over the 1974 piece by the ICP, The Communist Party in the Tradition of the Left, and this will be on part 5 of this text, Tactics. I've subtitled this, Party's Rigid Program Hinders Dynamic Revolutionary Strategy. The party at all times must be structured such that it's an organ of combat within the class war, maintaining a physical connection to the working class so it can engage in physical struggle, transcending mere intellectual victory. It must be in place to guide the proletariat through all stages of the class struggle, and in service of this, it requires complex, step-by-step plans of action which it is capable of carrying out. The tactical methods involved in this are not to be guided by moral prejudices, but by materialist analysis of the real relations between the various classes and between the parties that express the politics of these classes. Through this materialist analysis, there should be an assessment of events to come in the course of the struggle developed which weighs the various diverse situations that might arise. Through a process of tactical and strategic preparation in line with the invariant doctrine, binding choices are to be made in advance for what action to take under what circumstances. In service of this, the party requires predictive power and the ability to determine what actions are necessary to bring about the desired final outcomes. These in turn require an understanding of the forces at play, the actions and reactions amongst and between these forces, and the limitations on tactical action of the party, with the recognition that the party needs to anticipate that in different situations, the party must apply tactics in different ways, while also rejecting eclecticism. In conjunction with this, the party needs to recognize the complex nature of the class struggle, as it is not simply two contending classes acting alone in a unified manner. Hence, the party needs to advocate for tactical engagements to be based on regions and their level of capitalist development, and not based on particular nations, which is at best a shorthand. Tactics should continually be advanced in character, quality, and capacity to be utilized, else the party will cease development. In service of this, the party's organization needs to be developed in such a way that it can support all tactical action and expected development of those tactics. Therefore, the party's organization needs to be dynamic and develop in line with its tactics. The party's organization can be homogeneous and centralized, with the use of lists of tactical rules, eventualities, and long-term strategies for large territories. The fundamental factors of choosing tactical maneuvers are two: the party's ability to predict the results of a tactic, and the ability of the proletariat to carry it out materially and psychologically. And between potential tactics within that sphere, the choice between them is decided by whichever allows the party to make itself clearly distinct from any other organization, while maintaining its principles. For example, in the West, the party should take up the following official stances. 1. No alliance, front, or block with other political parties. 2. Support only for direct action amongst worker economic organizations. 3. No electoralism inside or outside the party, including consultating the opinions of the rank and file. To note, they are already doing this fundamentally by their own admission. They simply don't really want to be honest about it, as we talked about in the previous video. Functionally, the stance is an aim in their mind, not a reality, nor can it truly be one. 4. Call for the proletariat to move from bourgeois legalisms and towards revolutionary struggle, even for the defense of their most basic interests. Any gains within the electoral sphere for the proletariat are poison pills and contain the seeds for the destruction of those gains. There can be no reformism. And finally, 5. Attack all non-communist movements, no matter their quote-unquote alignment on political compass, quote-unquote, while showing that these non-communist movements simply stymie revolutionary development and thought, and that in reality, the things they call for support of can only be achieved in their totality via the class struggle, which must be done in particular ways which are actually effective. Therefore, they must be done under the guidance of the Communist Party. If a quote-unquote left government rises to power in the West, the party must ruthlessly and endlessly criticize it on grounds it has not and is incapable of actually achieving the aims of the proletariat in their totality, which the working class supports them on the basis of. The aim of this is to bring consciousness to the workers in which they understand the distinction between the class collaborationist aims of the left bloc that is in position compared to the duties and aims of the proletariat as a class. There should therefore be no solidarity with this left government, even if it is being attacked by the quote-unquote right. We cannot abandon our principles based on a false distinction of degrees of leftness. In addition, more broadly, there should be a refusal of any kind to support openly a political party that is deemed to be a better tactical terrain to operate in. The party needs to retain a strict stance of revolutionary action and rejection of reformist electoralism, so that it can show the proletariat that bourgeois politics is fundamentally smoke and mirrors, and regardless of the victorious party or bloc, the tactical terrain actually remains structurally the same. In fact, in many ways, under a quote-unquote left government, the tactical terrain is worse, because the tactical terrain also involves the various proletarians who get suckered in due to the class collaborationism. However, the party should direct the workers to support social democratic progressive policies for their immediate interests, but at the same time, wage a propaganda war upon the Social Democrats, aiming to show the proletariat that they do not need to sacrifice any autonomy to enter into bourgeois legalism aside from the bare minimum. Meanwhile, the party will constantly show that the actual policies promised were not and cannot be achieved through reformist legalisms and activities, and that the Social Democrats are in league with the bourgeoisie to quell dissent for the rule of the proletariat's class enemies. At all times, it must be remembered that the Social Democratic parties put forward demands that are tailor-made to make it seem like it is necessary for the whole of the proletariat to get behind them and wave their colors and flags. In response to this, the party should urge the proletariat to take direct action in the name of such policies, but not fall for such tricks which draw the workers under their banner. Ultimately, the key part of most social democratic policies cannot actually be carried out within the domain of bourgeois systems. When the social democratic parties fail to actually achieve what they have galvanized the proletariat for, the party needs to hammer in on the details and seek to compel the social democratic parties to put up or shut up, as it were. It must be noted that means and ends are in a dialectical relation, and the kinds of means one uses needs to lead to communism. We cannot utilize any and every potential tactic, regardless of effectiveness, as an incorrect one can lead to class collaborationism and the like. The ICP also claims that the party's program should focus only on the struggles that result in the final struggle for proletarian victory, rather than placing itself as a, quote, manager of transitions and accomplishments that do not directly affect the class that it represents, end quote. However, this is something that is self-harming in my personal view, and we can discuss this further if anybody wants to. That leads to lack of specificity in the same vein as those who claim that we should not add things like feminism to the program on the basis that Marxism is already necessarily feminist. I have seen this kind of claim before, but there are obvious issues with this because we need to establish ourselves and put ourselves out there and not simply say, oh, well, we already are that by definition. No, we need to carry out those sorts of actions clearly. Ultimately, though, the reasoning here aims to avoid the party becoming a sort of temporary stopgap measure to combat a given threat, abandoned right after rather than carrying out revolution. This is a good purpose right here. In service of this, they claim that the party should not apply any tactic which is compatible with opportunist political movements. This is more their party uniqueness stuff, which is fundamentally limits the party's activities based on the activities of other organizations, and thus allows other organizations to control the party even if it's in a negatory manner, right? They also demand that the party maintain its ground and not give up an inch or any of its autonomy by way of external pressure. However, this is an impossible task within bourgeois society. So long as you're not growing under these conditions, you are dying, and the mere basis of the moving terrain on which class struggle is fought means that the proletariat must act in defense of its ability to engage in any form of struggle. It must engage in quote-unquote transitional struggles to win itself ground on which to operate on. This isn't calling for, vote for the Democrats because, you'll have better organizational capacity or something like that. Quite the opposite. What I'm instead saying is, if you are a bunch of soldiers who are trying to cross over a bridge that has enemy emplacements on the other side, then you might need to go off and set up, defensive structures and push your way through, and go off to the side in order to get under defense or hide or anything along those lines, rather than just marching your way across. Even if the latter is more direct and more obvious, right? You do have to give up inches and grounds every so often in order to increase your placement. But that doesn't mean that you abandon the project to get to the other side of the bridge. All it means is that you are doing so in a less risky manner. Continuing, the program itself contains a perspective of a series of situations with an associated series of actions, which can be generally applied to those situations. There's a dialectical relation between programmatic directives and tactical rules. They influence one another. As such, knowledge of the situation is a major function of resolving tactical problems, and the program's series of actions are refined through experience by examining the situation and the effective actions called for by the program. The party itself must avoid any eclecticism or any integration of tactics that are not in a dialectical relation with our program except under the most dire of circumstances, and with the intent to restructure the program tactics to fit these new tactics when called up. Any examination of the situation to which apply action needs to account for both the party's capacities and the enemy's capacities, and the activities and interrelations of both and all factions of the enemy and self. The examination of the self principally requires an understanding of the support the party can expect to gain from the proletariat external to the party, which requires an understanding and prediction of economic and social issues which can be used to galvanize the proletariat. One form of action the party needs to undertake in any given situation is to take advantage of this understanding in order to lean into these social issues and propagandize, educate, and develop proletarian action. The party also needs to investigate the development of proletarian organizations and the spontaneous reactions of the proletariat to conditions, including their psychological reactions. This requires a study of sociology and psychoanalytical Marxist tendencies. In addition, the party needs to pay special attention to the state and how it's interrelating with various factions. A series of situations can be established in 5 major stages according to the ICP, and the tactics the party needs to constantly develop in response to the development of the series of actions within these terrains of situations. So, I don't think that you can automatically make a strong delineation between developments on the class terrain in this matter, because we also need to think about, the history of the given places. Like, for example, India's social democratic governance. Yeah, it's got its own history and its own class basis in terms of caste system and colonial legacy and its religious stuff going on, etc., etc. There's all sorts of things that are interrelated. Even if, all governments in the world are now social democratic governments, that doesn't necessarily mean that now we've got the exact same homogenous tactics and situations and so on and so forth that apply to all of these things in the exact same way. But they break it down into absolute feudal power, democratic bourgeois power, social democratic government, which is where we are synonymous in class terrain with fascism, intermediate period of social war in which the bases of the state becomes unstable, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. The party should not support any attempts by liberal democracy to restore a previous iteration of itself, where it is effective deep surveillance state, which is blatantly fascistic when capital is threatened, is abolished through bourgeois legal reform. From this perspective, fascism is quote-unquote historically progressive in the sense that bourgeois society will necessarily develop it in response to pressure from the proletariat, and is the most reactionary form of this system. There can be no return to a previous state of affairs, and we should not expend energy supporting factions of the bourgeoisie's attempts to do so. In the face of propaganda by the bourgeoisie calling for a return to liberal democracy through class collaboration, the proletariat must reply in revolutionary defeatism, denounce such propaganda, and direct class struggle based on the quote-unquote loss of democracy via the revolutionary vanguard in all countries. Any member of the bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie who seeks a quote-unquote return to democracy should submit themselves to the communist movement. The communist movement should not place itself behind the bourgeoisie in order to recover a historic political form of bourgeois society. The proletariat should recognize that a return to democracy at this stage of capitalist development is, in fact, impossible. Any form of democracy at this point is false, as the current development of capitalism precludes such an organizational form, and anyone calling for a return to the previous stage of development of capitalism can only be understood as reactionary. At best now, there is quote-unquote managed democracy. According to the ICP, the revolutionary position is to avoid any defeatist position and said anticipate an upsurge of the working class as the ability for the capitalist state to maintain fascist power wanes. However, this did not happen. Rather, the totalitarian power simply became more open, more progressive, quote-unquote, in form, and people were easily drawn into the society of control, unfortunately. Fascism, a form of social democracy, can be defined from 4 points of view: economic, social, political, and ideological. The economic point of view is an attempt at auto-control and limitation of capitalism in order to slow down the most alarming economic phenomena via centralized discipline. This makes it so the system's contradictions only build up and can never be released, thus requiring more and more discipline. The social point of view is the bourgeoisie attempting to give itself a collective class consciousness in vie of its individualist philosophy in order to combat the proletariat's class forces. The political is a constituted stage at which a ruling class denounces, officially or unofficially, schemas of liberal tolerance as useless, proclaims the method of single-party government, and liquidates the old hierarchies of servants of capital that are too ingrained in the democratic state and its methods of repression of proletariat by trickery. Lastly, ideologically, fascism aligns with a false class consciousness, by speaking of a nation rather than class, the juridical equivalent of individuals before the law, and maintaining its organizational structure based on the entire social collectivity while carrying the terminologies of working class movements. We see this now in varying forms in all bourgeois states, even if they kowtow to liberal tolerances and multiple parties. Like, just look at some of the quotes from Kamala Harris, for instance, to say nothing of Donald Trump, but a great example of this sort of stuff out of Kamala Harris, out of Biden, all across the board. Anyway, continuing. The party's ability to influence external activities should be kept within the limitations of pre-planned knowledge of tactics to use at given times in order to carry them out. Note this does not leave room for trying new tactics based on an understanding of the terrain and puts a time-based cap on the development of new tactics at a necessarily arbitrary point. Ideally, the party can develop propaganda and slogans in the workshop, rather than in the instant moment, as these need to be based on the real life of the party and dialectically connected to the whole of it, not merely specifically for one action the party might be carrying out at a time. In addition, principles and doctrine are dialectically related to action, developing dynamically alongside the actions the party takes. Thus, the actions, and thereby the tactics, and thereby the organizational structure, all influence principles and doctrine. The party hence develops as competing material interests push social groups into struggle, who in turn organize to fight the struggle in varying ways. Through the actions they take, the successes and failures, theory is developed, and this theory in turn is applied to future struggles, and the organization is honed. If these historic experiences are ignored or distorted, then the development of the organization and struggle is harmed. Fundamentally, the party itself must be recognized to be a dynamic organism, with a feedback loop between its real-life activity and its organizational structure, program, tactics and strategy, doctrine and theory, revolutionary aim, rules of operation and praxis, guiding principles, internal conditions including its rank and file composition, all within an external environment. All these are interconnected and affect one another, and to say something about one of these is necessarily to say something about all the rest. If you can identify an ideal universal tactic, then you can in turn identify an ideal universal organizational structure necessary to support that tactic. This dialectically unified party applies historical lessons to determine optimal configurations for these elements, and understands how they dialectically influence and transform each other, ensuring constant adaptation and development in service of proletarian revolution, reproducing itself materially in such a way that maintains dynamic equilibrium, and thus adapting to changing conditions while staying true to its revolutionary core. This would recognize the necessity of direct and continuous feedback through consultation of the rank and file of their activities and necessities, while gathering as much information as possible rather than immediately blackboxing every recursion below the center, and aim to be an active agent of history, and seek to influence the external environment in ways favorable to all other aspects, through all other aspects. This dialectically unified party is significantly divergent in theoretical basis compared to the organic centralist model, which I will be addressing in its own video out of a compilation of my analyses of their words describing it and critiques of it. And I'll be doing a bit of a weighing compared to democratic and dialectical centralist models, but not too much on that. Unfortunately, as we talked about in terms of Lenin, the organic centralist, they very specifically aim to avoid actually describing anything in any sort of concrete method, out of some confused idea that simply not saying something makes it so it's not existent or something along those lines. It's very silly, but that's essentially their way of thinking about these things. So I do the best that I can to try and concretize it, but that's limited. Anyway, continuing. The proletariat needs to be constantly reminded that the state is a system of intense barbarism and will shed its human face the moment it is actually threatened, and that therefore the proletariat needs to train, organize, and arm itself in preparation for this inevitability. For the proletariat to accept this reality, the party needs to demonstrate on all levels that it is anti-legalist. In order to do that, in turn, it must build organizational structures and formations that can engage in militant struggle against immediate bourgeois counteroffensives, and train both the party and masses close to it about the necessary action to take and how to carry out those actions. Actually, let's take a look at the quotation in particular. What then is organic centralism? We will certainly not deny ourselves here by giving a series of rules, a code, a regulation, or worse, a statute. Rather, we will recall some of the cornerstones of our way of working, which already partly outlined in the preceding text, citing the party at various times of its existence, without forgetting that our history teaches us that the acquisition of our method cannot derive from bookish descriptions, however detailed they may be. So in other words, they say, oh, we're not actually going to concretely explain anything about our organizational methodology or anything along those lines. So, typical. And completely unhelpful for anybody trying to actually learn what it is that they're doing. So, back to the text. In addition, no initiatives or attitudes should be adopted which threaten the long-term needs of the party's struggle. On the proverbial highway, we can't suddenly decide we're going to do something else, then walk to the other side. We can go around obstacles rather than walking straight. We can go back to pick up a tool that is needed to get past obstacles. We can go to the side to get more people to go with us, and so on. But the aim and intention and the plans should always have the final goal in mind, and should not risk the ability to reach that final goal. Indeed, at no point should any temporary deviations be considered an end or aim in themselves. only the final aim should be in the mind, with the very specifics only being done insofar as we can determine that they are necessary for that final goal to be reached. The ICP also says that the party should not get involved directly on the ground, but instead organize with trade unions and a coalition which will lead to direct action struggle. It is within the trade union coalition that the party will be represented. I don't believe that this will work as much as they think it will, because the party needs to be seen as an active agent which the proletariat can go to, not as an inactive one that people simply wear the colors of when engaging in direct struggle at some other organization's event. The ICP claims that the aim of this is to not present the parties attached to other organizations involved in such progressive movements, so that when these organizations fail, the party is recognized as external to them, as something the proletariat can move towards without remaining with the failures. But in reality, I can only really imagine that this will just lead people to identify the party as a fence-sitter opportunist that only gets involved in the fight after everyone else has expended themselves and victory is certain. Certainly nothing to ever actually rely on for anything, which is the exact opposite of the aim here. So either I'm misunderstanding what they're calling for in these terms or something else. I don't know. Next, the party needs to show unequivocally that the fascist militias and whatnot that attack proletarian movements are, in fact, in cahoots with the bourgeois governments, especially when the state says that the proletariat cannot arm itself or defend itself against the right. In this situation is the liberal, white moderate that is the greatest threat, as it calls for legality in order to render the proletariat defenseless and disorganized, as they cease being able to protect themselves outside the boundaries of the legal system designed to take advantage of this. The proletariat thus should be advised to never under any circumstances hand over their weaponry to the bourgeois state under the threat of the far right. For example, the risk of the far right taking power through a coup, resulting in the liberal social democrat government calling for the disarmament of the whole people. In addition, the proletariat should at no point, regardless of circumstances, declare any loyalty to any bourgeois state in the face of the threat. Though I personally don't see anything necessarily wrong with the party accepting quote-unquote loyalty and then instantly betraying them. And that's actually how the October Revolution and the Kornilov affair went down, wherein the provisional government straight out said, we are not actually able to govern our places, and this is mostly due to the development of dual power. So they straight out armed the Bolsheviks and so on and said, we need you to carry out policing and stuff. And the Bolsheviks said, okay. And then they took the guns and then they didn't give them back and declared the achievement of the dictatorship of the proletariat and took power. And when the soldiers were dispatched by the provisional government, the workers refused to transport them by train to the cities, thus allowing the revolution to continue being carried out. So I don't necessarily see anything wrong with doing a pretend sort of thing and then instantaneously betraying them. Though I don't think it is particularly likely that they will do that again in the future. So, continuing, in terms of the United Front, it should only, at most, be with proletarian economic organizations that are autonomous, engage in direct action which gains or protects the interests of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, wherein such attacks support the development of the offensive. In addition, the party should only accept external support when it is at the lead and making all determinations, as other organizations need to recognize that the party's victory will achieve their ends. It should never be the other way around. Fundamentally, the need for the reconstitution of the party in a revolutionary stance will come about only when the proletariat recognizes that no other organization can achieve their needs. This requires that the party take a stance against any opportunism, which results in alliance with other organizations, which creates the idea that the party requires its organizations. Of course, this is from the perspective of a party which does not actually require its organizations, and instead is getting their support as a simple extra that it doesn't necessarily need. This is, of course, not all times the case. This is a sort of prefigurative politics wherein the party fakes it until it makes it. And that can work in some conditions for some amount of time, but the party is not able to carry out the tasks it claims to want to do because it lacks support, then that's synonymous with the party being unable to carry out tactics, organization, doctrine, program, aims, and so on. Being unable to carry these out, in turn, are synonymous with the party entering into a state of death because it lacks movement and growth. The party is not doing either, then has no choice but to take action to revive itself, which in turn means new tactics. Continuing, the movements the party participates in cannot be directed by any super party or superior organization above and over party affiliates. The party must either be the dominant force in any movement, or must only be a united front of opportunity without any greater organizations. At all times, our position must be to crush the liberty to own, oppress, and exploit in all bourgeois forms. The bourgeois system has codified and legalized, and thus tamed, forms of direct economic action by the proletariat, such as unions. The organizational structure that unions' legal forms have created is such that it produces yellow unions in the same form as in fascist society. Through social democratic reforms, it has created a society of control to give the proletariat quote-unquote skin in the game. Through class collaboration, and thus created a golden prison led by yellow leaders managing us in our own name. However, the focus of the proletariat must be in aiming solely for the establishment of its dictatorship, which is the only solution to this higher development of capitalism. To do this, the proletariat must struggle in all forms directly against the bourgeoisie in such a way that the struggle cannot be recuperated by class collaboration of any form in thought, political attitude, or combative action. All such struggles need to be unified into a single organism that is international in scope, exists in all phases of the development of the struggle, and will continue to struggle until victory. In terms of party action, it needs to make it clear at all times that the proletariat cannot, at any point, adequately reach its class interests through the electoral process, much less achieve political power. The class struggle cannot be fought within the terrain of legal electoral struggle, but only in the historical conjuncture and balance of forces between the contending classes. The best way to develop such is necessarily a complete rejection of the political structure of capitalist society, with the intent of developing of revolutionary armed assault. Therefore, at no point should the party or any worker organization recognize the validity of bourgeois society and its decisions. Within local elections, the party needs to keep in mind the general objective, which is principally the aim to make it clear that the party is completely against the ruling order, and is thus distinct from all other organizations. The party should agitate for general historical demands, and as the class struggle develops, seek to develop class-based representative organs which engage in struggle, solely in the interests of the proletariat, otherwise known as worker councils. The party continually aims for the final goal, even under the conditions where a progressive policy might help some individual grouping within the proletariat. Liberation is through the proletariat as a whole, which contains all of these groups, not for an individual group, which are unable to attain liberation external to the class movement ultimately. The platforms of these partial groups, therefore, should be extracted and made in line with the party's program, and these progressive movements criticized for the conservative character they necessarily have. The ICP rejects any form of quote-unquote intermediatism, where an effort is used, primarily in the legal form, to maintain the benefits won by the working class. They reject any sort of greater positioning being made possible through small gains which create a more safe or fertile class terrain for struggle, on the grounds that aiming for such gives ground for opportunists. However, this was a poor strategy born out of fear for something, opportunism, which they need to figure out how to deal with, not shy away from, and that is done through organizational correctness and activity, which will fix tactics such that they cannot be utilized by opportunists. In order to get the proletariat to struggle on the revolutionary terrain, we need to fundamentally convince it of the fact that the electoral terrain is a losing battlefield. Thus, within reactionary times, electoralism is feasible, since it demonstrates to the proletariat the futility of such activities, because none of their electoralism will result in anything, and thereby allows the construction of more militant organizational form and application of such tactics. During conditions wherein revolutionary attack is at all possible, electoralist actions become terrain for the defeat of the proletariat, diverting the proletariat from the correct battlefield, hence calls for electoralism and everything connected to it lead to backward steps in proletarian class potential. And that is my summary of the Communist Party and the Tradition of the Left, Part 5, Tactics. As usual, if you'd like to go over the quotations I derived this summary from, you can go into the Google Doc found in the description below. And you'll also find a link to the United Marxist Pact Discord server if you want to talk about this text or any of the others that we've gone over. Please consider giving it a join, and we'd love to have you. Tomorrow we will be going over the final part in this, the ICP, the Communist Party and Tradition of the Left, Conclusion and Appendix. Thank you for joining me for today's topical summary, and I hope to see you then.